can't believe we're at the state where we have to do this, but we have to affirm that sex does mean biological sex. That should be the official nationwide interpretation of that word. And if that takes the Supreme Court to rule on that, well, so be it. But we can't have these like little word games that are constantly popping up. This sends a very bad precedent for lawmaking in general when we have to do this. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for the week ending in April 25th, 2025. We are here with Jos and me, Arianne. First, a summary of the news. A trans-identified male runner competes in the women's division of the Boston Marathon. A federal court blocks Trump's order banning X gender-neutral indicators on passports. The Supreme Court hearings are held on a case involving religious freedom and LGBTQ+ in schools. Brazil imposes new restrictions on pediatric transition. Bellevue public schools change trans-identified student policy. And the Nebraska Legislature debates the Stand with Women Act. First, some sports news. The Boston Marathon took place on April 21st. And one of the competitors in the women's race was a trans-identified male named Rhea Susing. As Redux's Amy Ham reported back in December of last year, Susing qualified with a time of 4 hours, 1 minute, and 27 seconds, which was enough to qualify him for the women's cutoff of 4 hours and 5 minutes, but would not have been enough to qualify him for the men's cutoff of 3 hours and 35 minutes. This is not the first time he has competed in the women's category. According to women's sports advocate and former elite gymnast Jennifer Say, writing for the New York Post, quote, Susing has competed in races in the female category more than 338 times since 2009, medaling for his age group more than 140 times, unquote. Nor is Susing new to controversy. As women's advocate Beth Bourne pointed out on X, Susing back in 2013 filed a Better Business Bureau complaint about a Virginia spa that removed him from a women's area following customer and staff requests. In other words, Susing left a long trail of being a rabble-rouser who shows no compunction about infringing on women's privacy and opportunities. And yet the Boston Marathon still let him compete as a woman. When will they get the memo and stop falling for this scam? And now we'll turn to a couple of court-related news stories. A federal judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration's executive order that halted the processing of passport applications with an X gender marker. The policy that was announced in January of 2025 was challenged by the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and a group of trans-identified men and women and gender advocates who argued that it violated constitutional rights. This stemmed from an executive order President Trump signed called Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. The order states that federal identification documents, including passports, reflect only the binary sexes of male and female, deeming gender as unchangeable. The State Department, under Secretary of State Marco Rubio, issued a directive to suspend all applications requesting an X as their gender marker on U.S. passports. This move reversed a policy initiated in 2022 that allowed individuals to select M, F, or X as their gender marker on U.S. passports. The ACLU filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts, representing 7 trans-identified men and women plaintiffs. The lawsuit contended that the executive order and the subsequent State Department policy were discriminatory and violated the Administrative Procedures Act due to lack of a required 60-day notice and comment period, and infringed upon the plaintiffs' constitutional rights, including equal protection and freedom of movement. The federal judge's temporary block on this policy allows the processing of passport applications with the X gender markers to resume and lets individuals update their gender markers on existing passports. However, real concerns exist when inaccurate gender markers are used. Passports are legal documents tied to international treaties and identity verification systems. Inaccurate markers can cause discrepancies with other official records like birth certificates, driver's licenses, and criminal databases, and this complicates legal processes. Fraud vulnerability becomes easier for someone to manipulate identity across jurisdictions. Some countries do not recognize altered gender markers, and travelers may face denial of entry, detention, or harassment. Inconsistent documentation raises red flags at borders, increasing the risk of being flagged for fraud or subjected to invasive questioning. Gender is one component of biometric and demographic profiling. Mismatched or fluid data may compromise efforts to track down known criminals, missing persons, or fugitives. Additional issues include travel risk and national security and data integrity. The Trump administration has indicated plans to appeal the court's decision, which could lead to further legal actions and potential Supreme Court involvement. Now, turning to news from the U.S. Supreme Court. On April 22nd, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments for the Mahmoud versus Taylor case. We have mentioned this case before. It involves a group of parents in Montgomery County, Maryland, who wanted the right to opt their children out of classes in schools that involved LGBTQ-themed books. The parents include Christians, Jews, and Muslims, who argue their religious freedom is violated when their kids are forced to participate in these lessons. These parents lost their cases in front of two lower courts who claimed the family's religious freedom wasn't violated because the kids were not actually required to change their beliefs. However, the justices on the conservative-leaning Supreme Court seemed more sympathetic to the parents. Samuel Alito, who is from the conservative bench on the Supreme Court, asked why it was such a big deal to simply allow the parents to opt their kids out of the controversial curriculum. Alan E. Schoenfeld, the attorney for the school district, argued it would be infeasible because that would require working out the logistics of having separate classrooms for the opt-out children. But Justice Brett Kavanaugh, himself a lifelong resident of Montgomery County, expressed skepticism of Schoenfeld's answer, pointing out that Montgomery County and Maryland have a long history of religious liberty. Presumably, this is a reference to the fact that Maryland was established as a refuge for Catholics fleeing persecution by Protestants. Now, one of the books that became a highlight of the discussion was called Uncle Bobby's Wedding. This book features the story of a girl who is worried she will not be able to spend as much time with her uncle after he marries his boyfriend. Justice Alito said, quote, "It has a clear moral message, and it may be a good message. It's just a message that a lot of religious people disagree with," unquote. On the other hand, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, speaking from the liberal bench, noted that the book did not have pictures of two men kissing, nor did it speak on the morality of same-sex marriage per se. And her exchange with Justice Alito proved to be quite testy, featuring interruptions. Justice Gorsuch chose to focus on another book called Pride Puppy. This book features a puppy who goes to a pride parade, with each letter of the alphabet representing a different item or person the puppy encounters. Gorsuch drew attention to the fact, acknowledged by Schoenfeld, that one of the letters represented drag queens. However, when Gorsuch asked about the leather and bondage allegedly featured in the book, Schoenfeld denied it, saying there was only a woman in leather. By the way, you can find people reading from the book on YouTube. Go look it up and judge for yourself if you are curious. I personally thought that there was a woman wearing what looked like a bondage cap for the letters H for hats. I also saw various pride flags, progress flags, a flag for the org P flag, and yes, the letter Q was for, quote, "queen in a beautiful dress," unquote. And that featured a picture of a drag queen as well as a queer pride sign. There is a lot there, and like I said, judge for yourself. Anyway, going back to the Supreme Court case at hand, Justice Ketanji Brown also expressed skepticism about the parents' case, pointing out the possibility that parents could homeschool their kids or send them to private schools. Eric S. Baxter, the parents' attorney, said that was an unrealistic option for parents, pointing out the high costs of doing so for working families. Much of the debate revolved around whether the Montgomery school curriculum consisted of exposure, that is, just exposing kids to ideas without forcing anything, or coercion. For example, Justice Gorsuch brought up the guidance materials for teachers, which included the instruction that if a student says that a boy cannot be a girl, the teacher should call out that remark as hurtful. Justice Gorsuch asked if this instructional material is simply exposure or coercion. First, Schoenfeld hedged by saying that, quote, record is seriously underdeveloped, unquote, about how the instruction material should be used. However, when pressed by Gorsuch about a situation where a teacher does in fact use that lesson, Schoenfeld said that it would simply be, quote, exposure to particular ideas and teaching students to be civil in the classroom, unquote. Overall, media reports suggest that the Supreme Court, with its conservative majority, will likely side with the parents against the school board. So what should we make of this case? It is an important battle in the larger fight between LGBTQ in schools and religious freedom, as well as parental rights. On one hand, I think the school board definitely overreached with this LGBTQ curriculum. I already brought up the example of Pride Puppy, which I think is kind of bizarre and annoyingly preachy at best, and at worst, outright creepy and inappropriate for young pre-K children. There were other books as well, like Born Ready, The True Story of a Boy Named Penelope, which is by Jodi Patterson, the chair of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation board, and is about her daughter's decision to transition and start identifying as a boy. Both of these books appear to be or feature propaganda from LGBTQ plus NGOs like the Human Rights Campaign Foundation and PFLAG. I don't think it's a good idea to have these wealthy, powerful NGOs set the public school curriculum. I also do think we need to be considerate of religious freedom and freedom of belief more generally. I don't think we are doing ourselves any favors as LGB people, or for that matter, as TQ people, to be imposing our values on other people's families through the public school system, just like we wouldn't want conservative religious families imposing their values in public schools. The exchange between Gorsuch and Schoenfeld, when Schoenfeld admitted that enforcing recognizing gender identity was merely exposure and not coercion, was very telling. It demonstrated that Montgomery County school administrators have serious blind spots about what they consider neutral exposure. They seem to think lecturing students about respecting gender identity is just an innocuous manner of teaching kids to be polite rather than ideological indoctrination, even though ideological indoctrination is kind of what it is. It also strikes me as callous for Justice Ketanji Brown to tell parents to send their kids to private schools or homeschool if they don't approve of the public school curriculum. Private and homeschooling options are extraordinarily costly and burdensome. Public schools exist as a tuition-free option available to all residents, offering a balanced curriculum that's fair for everyone. Parents have a right to send their kids to a public school free of propaganda. On the other hand, where do we draw the line? Simply bringing up a book with a storyline about a gay adult doesn't strike me as necessarily coercive. And part of me does worry that if schools are obligated to bend over backwards for every possible religious objection, they simply will be afraid of addressing any potential hot-button topic at all, including sexual orientation. Justice Kagan also expressed the concern that granting a carte blanche right for parents to opt their kids out of anything they want due to religion may be excessively broad and grant too much discretion to parents over school curriculums. I think she has a fair point here. So while I have little sympathy for the Montgomery County School Board in this case, I do wonder how a ruling can be crafted that offers reasonable accommodation and that does not open a whole different can of worms. Anyway, please let us know in the comment section what you think. And with that, what have you got, Joss?
Thanks, Arianne. Starting in Brazil. From Bernard Lane on genderclinicnews.com, the Federal Council of Medicine in Brazil has adopted a more cautious position on the medicalization of young Brazilians. The Council approved a resolution banning puberty blockers for youth with distress around their gender identity and brought the minimum age for cross-sex hormones up to age 18. Additionally, youth will have to wait until age 21 to undergo any gender-related surgery that would sterilize them. Worth noting is that the Council has the power to remove licenses from doctors who continue to medicalize and sterilize youth outside of these new guidelines. The resolution follows the trend of caution cited in the CAS review and was adopted unanimously by the board. Now moving on to two stories out of Nebraska. Last week, the Bellevue Public Schools Board of Education in Nebraska voted to approve changes to their policies regarding trans-identifying students. The school board's revisions to the district's administrative regulation known as Code 511 include the following. Students are now required to use restroom and locker room facilities as well as participate in physical education classes and intramural sports based on their biological sex, not their gender identity. Teachers and staff are permitted to inform parents if a student identifies as trans, and the updated guidelines remove definitions related to gender identity and gender expression. Superintendent Jeff Ripe stated that the policy revisions were influenced by concerns from parents and students, as well as considerations regarding federal funding. He emphasized the importance of adhering to federal guidelines, stating, quote, "10 million is what we get in federal funding, and that means a lot to this school district. Speaking personally, we cannot afford to lose 10 million, end quote. The board allowed an hour of public comment before voting unanimously to approve the changes. These changes to Bellevue Public Schools came just 1 week before the Nebraska Legislature debated LB 89, the Stand With Women Act, and that's where we'll move to now. We've previously discussed the efforts of State Senator Kathleen Kauth to protect young women and girls in school sports, locker rooms, and restrooms. The floor debate on the legislation was just this past Tuesday, April 22nd. As you'll recall, we provided a link to watch the live debate in last week's news coverage. I watched some of the debate, and it was rather spirited, to say the least. Supporters of the legislation provided common-sense reasons for their position by citing statistics and studies. Opponents of the legislation used fanciful rhetoric and personal anecdotes as they spoke. One senator who opposes the legislation started by saying she had a lot of important points to cover, but first she wanted to address the quote-unquote rainbow parents in the audience. And then, rather than give an iota of fact-based reasoning, she waxed poetic about rainbows, double rainbows, and pots of gold. I wish I were joking, but I'm not. She was so distracted with rainbows that she never addressed a single one of those very important points she first mentioned. On a personal note, this sort of nonsensical approach to debate from Democrats makes me feel extremely embarrassed by my party. And the thing is, mainstream journalists use feeling-based, feeling-focused language when they report on issues around gender ideology too. First Alert 6 News used this headline to talk about the debate. Nebraska Legislature votes on bill on transgender athletes' restrooms. Debate comes a day after faith leaders urge bill to be voted down. They did not say debate comes a day after the ACLU published a list of Nebraska faith leaders, many of whom are retired, in the Omaha World Herald who allegedly oppose LB 89. They did not mention the faith leaders who have spoken in support of the Stand With Women Act, but the list from the ACLU made the article's subheading. The use of the suicide myth and flowery language around inclusion and the invocation of LGB when positioning this as an LGBTQ issue really irks me. But let me not lose focus. So a debate was held and a filibuster-proof majority voted to move forward with the legislation. However, Senator Ripe, who voted to move forward, also said he would withdraw his support if the final version of the bill did not include his amendments. In reading through those amendments, I'm of the opinion that it guts the intent of the bill by removing the term biological throughout. Senator Kauth uses biological 9 times to describe and define sex, and the word is completely removed from Senator Ripe's version. And by excluding language around bathrooms and locker rooms, it just guts it. His amendments are AM 1138 and will be linked in our show notes so you can compare for yourselves. Perhaps I'm overreaching here. Please share your thoughts with us. What do you think would be the point of removing the term biological in reference to sex throughout his amended version? So things are in a state of flux around LB 89. It is set to move forward, but it would take hefty concessions from Senator Kauth to get it across the finish line. And once it's over the finish line, if it includes Senator Ripe's amendments, is it really going to be effective at protecting young women and girls in Nebraska schools? We urge our viewers in Senator Ripe's district of Ralston to reach out and share your thoughts with his office about why you support Kathleen Kauth's original bill. And I'm curious, what do you think, Arianne? Why would the term biological be removed?
Well, that's a good question. And I think the reason is because if you remove biological, you can redefine sex to mean what you want. And one possibility is just to redefine sex to whatever it says on your legal identity. Like sometimes birth certificates are changed now to reflect your different sex than you were born with, your identity, your gender identity. And if you redefine sex, or even if you just are very sneaky and remove that term biological, then that opens up this whole Trojan horse of, well, okay, as long as your legal certificate says you're a particular sex, then that's your sex. And it reminds me of similar debates that have been had recently over the NCAA announcing their decision to only allow like women in, the women's division, and how the only source that they're using to validate that are legal like birth certificates. They're not actually doing any biological sex testing. And so a lot of women's rights advocates in sports, like Jennifer Say, for example, have drawn attention to this loophole. So that's what I think is going on.
I suspect you're right. I'm right there on the same page with you of curiosity around that, because in addition to removing the locker rooms and restrooms, like that's just taken off. So Senator Kauth's version had in schools locker rooms and restroom provision. So he removes that altogether. But then the removal of biological sex, at that point, if it passes with this amendment, which is apparently the only way it will get past their filibuster proof numbers, then it's nothing. Then it's a bill that if somebody has a birth certificate that says they're the opposite sex because it's their gender identity and they've had it changed, they can go into the bathrooms and restrooms already because his bill already removes locker rooms and restrooms, and they could play on whatever sports team they want to because their birth certificate says whatever it says. It seemed very purposeful to me to have that line biological removed. I think that passing it at that point would just be a name only that it got done, but would it actually be useful?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's why sex, we can't believe we're at the state where we have to do this, but we have to affirm that sex does mean biological sex. That should be the official nationwide interpretation of that word. And if that takes the Supreme Court to rule on that, well, so be it. But we can't have these like little word games that are constantly popping up. This sends a very bad precedent for lawmaking in general when we have to do this.
Absolutely agree. And I almost do think that we need that through the Supreme Court at this point. Like the UK had theirs last week. That was a major win for just locking that down. Like we shouldn't have to lock it down. We have all these words that we agree about. But we're finding over and over again, we do have to have some sort of legal agreement about this language because the lines are so blurred from trans activism around terms like lesbian, around sex, of course, but all of these things are so blurred, blurred to the point of making them useless. If we can't agree on language, if blue means orange to somebody, then how do we even communicate at all?
Yeah, and I'd also like to draw attention to the fact that this is Nebraska. This is a conservative state. We're not talking like a state that's like we're not talking California or Oregon here. So this is just an important warning that this sort of madness can happen anywhere. Don't think that you're safe.
Yeah, you're not safe, and the thing is, right, like the the language is consistent throughout this country from journalism, from journalists, and from the ACLU, who is everywhere in this like they have their hands in every pot, trying to stir it up with their view of what this should be. So know this very well. Like the ACLU is out there doing work in every state, in every community, and while you have on the one hand Bellevue Public School saying we want to protect our federal funding, we're going to establish these guidelines, the very next week, here we are in the state of Nebraska trying to get that same legislation statewide, and you have one senator that's being very difficult about getting it there. So it's just there's so much up and down, back and forth, and it would all of it comes back down to realism and sensibility and believing what your eyes see and what your ears hear and what you understand to be real versus allowing propaganda to skew your viewpoint. And to read things critically and to engage with the news critically, because I think far too often, especially my colleagues on the left, lean into what they're hearing from the media, and it's very skewed.
That's an excellent point about how journalism is like pretty much the same nationwide with their language. It's sort of like rather than it's not like regional dialects of journalese. It's just journalese language, and then the rest of us have to sort of use an interpreter to figure out what exactly they mean by some of their terminology. And it's really problematic, and journalists, I think they're making themselves very out of touch with the public when they do that.
Yeah, they're definitely not listening to the public. They're not responding to what the public are saying because we see the statistics of voting that has been done in states and communities nationwide. There was even a poll I saw recently in California that a majority of Democratic Californian voters do not support males competing in the female category. They don't care what gender identity anyone has. I don't remember the exact number, so I won't cite it specifically, but the over and over again, the public is saying we are taking a common sense approach. It is the media that is saying, but be kind, but inclusivity, LGBTQ, and it is the ACLU, and it is these unfortunately HRC and GLAAD and NCLR, these orgs that are pushing this agenda while the public is saying, but no, this doesn't make sense. And it's painful because they're trying so hard to find some kind of middle line or trying to be kind about it. Like even in reading people who don't agree, they are so soft in the way that they push back at these school board meetings and different places when they're pushing back against this. It's not about the person. They're not trying to be harmful or hateful or anything to an individual, especially an individual in distress. A youth, like teens are always in distress. They're in a permanent distress from the age of like 13 to 17. So they're exceptionally kind about it, but they still have to push back.
Yeah, and that makes me think of that Mahmoud case that I talked about in front of the US Supreme Court, where these families had children that were exposed to really these very bizarre stories that seem to be written in part by the LGBTQ groups. And I can't believe it's only these religious families who are scratching their heads at some of this material. I suspect there are probably other families out there who think this is a little bit weird, but maybe are afraid of pushing back. And that's, like you were saying, a lot of these parent groups, they don't want to be mean. They don't they're not trying to do anything mean. They just don't like what's going on and want their input. And it's terrible that we're having such a hard time with this dialogue that we now have to take these things all the way to the Supreme Court.
And it's a little bit insane that Justice Brown would say, "Oh, just take your kid to the private school. Oh, just homeschool." Like, what? 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 I recall distinctly, and I don't know if they still do this in schools, but when I hit fifth and then sixth grade, our school system did like puberty type talks, like, "Oh, y'all kind of smell bad. Maybe use some deodorant." Like, just some very basic things. They took the girls into one room and they showed us about feminine hygiene products, that sort of thing. And parents at that point, this was, I'm not going to say when it was because it was long enough ago, but parents were able to opt their children out if they didn't want to do it. They were just taken to a separate room while the rest of us had this little like mini course in personal hygiene and growing up in puberty. So there are absolutely workarounds for families who don't want to have their kids engage with this material if that's the way it is. But there's also something, like you mentioned, to be said about the kind of material that they're being presented with. So like Florida has banned a lot of books. Some of them that got banned are probably really good books, but some of them that got banned are really bad books. And so it's who's the arbiter of what's good or bad? Who says this thing is crazy, this thing is not? But it's also the way that we have been subsumed by trans activism. Like, LGBT people were just normal, regular people, but now we have this whole thing branded on us of being this crazy activist group. And I feel like similarly, like some of those books have gotten caught up in book bans in that same way. Like, good books have been drawn down with the really crazy ones that deserve to not be on bookshelves for elementary, middle, and even high school students.
Yeah, I agree. When I've been following some of these stories about the book bans, often what happens is it's like there's maybe like one person who objects to a huge number of books. And so those books are removed just because of that one person. And I don't think that's a good solution either. On one hand, it's absolutely essential that schools and libraries, I mean, they should listen to public input, and schools in particular should really be listening to parents. Otherwise, the whole system falls apart when it's just the schools are not meant to like be taking kids away from parents and indoctrinating them. They need to communicate with parents. But at the same time, I don't think like one particularly pearl-clutching parent should have the right to just veto everything. There needs to be good dialogue. And unfortunately, that is something that is seriously lacking in modern America. And on that note, thank you everyone for listening to this week's News Roundup, and we hope to see you again next week.
I have a lot of thoughts prepared and collected about the failures of this bill, and I may or may not get to them, but I want to speak to some other things first. I want to speak to my friends and fellow parents sitting up in the balcony, the rainbow parents. I was thinking about that, about the fact that the whole queer identity is wrapped up in a rainbow. And being Irish, rainbows have specific meaning, and the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is something magical and mystical and beautiful and inclusive. And we are taught from a very young age to look for them and to be in awe of them. And it's really exciting when you see a double rainbow, because that's even more unusual and rare, and it's fleeting. And we have to take the time to acknowledge it and appreciate it. And so that is what it means to be a part of the queer community. And the family around the queer community is to take the time to recognize your beauty, your individuality, how special you are, that you bring beauty into this world, and that it is important and it means something, and it means so much to me.